The Ad Astra drifted silently through the inky blackness of space, her hull patched together with whatever the crew could find. The lights flickered overhead in time with the faint hum of the reactors, struggling to keep the ship alive. What had once been a graceful freighter was now little more than a battleground of scavenged parts, hastily welded frames, and jury-rigged systems. The Federation had seen fit to give humanity a ship so outdated it was almost laughable, a vessel barely able to survive the void, let alone explore it. And yet somehow it was working. Kara Hawkins, the ship's chief engineer, had learned long ago how to make things work. She'd never been given the luxury of perfection. Growing up on the industrial fringes of Earth, she had spent her youth in a world of rusted machines and discarded tech. She was a scavenger, a maker, a repairer of things that others had written off. When she had first set foot on the Ad Astra, she'd been horrified by its condition, but she'd also seen potential in its decay. There was something in the ship's skeletal structure that called to her. A challenge, a puzzle that she could fix. And fix it she had. There was no manual for this ship, no instructions on how to make something that was never meant to work. But there was no turning back. The crew had chosen their path, and now they were making history. The pulse cannon that Kara had unearthed in the ship's ancient Federation data logs had been their turning point. It was the key to everything. With it, they had the power to change their destiny. The weapon had already taken out one target, the Federation scout ship that had been foolish enough to stray too close. And that victory had ignited something deep inside the crew. They had proven it could be done. They had the firepower. And now they had to use it. Kara leaned over the engine's control panel, fingers flying across the interface as she monitored the reactor's power output. Every moment felt like a tightrope walk. The systems were unstable, pushing the boundaries of what the ship was capable of, and Kara was at the center of it all, orchestrating the impossible. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she watched the glowing lines of data flash across the screen, feeling the weight of each decision pressing on her chest. "Reactor core is holding," Kara said, her voice steady despite the tension. But just barely. Grace Redford's voice came through the comm system, cool and unshakable. "We don't have time to wait for barely, Kara. How much longer until we're ready to engage?" Kara didn't look up, her eyes scanning the array of status lights. "A few hours if we're lucky. The system's underpowered for the kind of output we're pushing it to. Every time we fire that cannon, it's a miracle the whole damn thing doesn't blow apart." "Then get lucky, Kara," Grace replied sharply. "We need to know what we're dealing with before the Federation decides to send more ships our way." The tension on the bridge was palpable, a mix of anxiety and anticipation. They had come too far to stop now. The Ad Astra had become more than just a ship. It was a symbol, an embodiment of humanity's refusal to be shackled by the limits imposed upon them. The Federation had expected them to fail. They had handed over a junk ship and waited for the crew to fall apart. But humanity had done the impossible. They had turned it into a weapon. The ship lurched suddenly, a warning light flashing across Kara's console. "What now?" Grace's voice crackled through, sharp and demanding. Kara cursed under her breath, her hands moving quickly to stabilize the ship. "The power grid's fluctuating. We're getting some interference from outside the ship, likely from a nearby star's radiation. It's messing with the navigation systems." "Can you fix it?" Grace asked, her tone showing no sign of panic, only determination. "I'll try, but we're on borrowed time here. The ship's systems weren't designed to handle this kind of stress." Before Kara could finish, the communication system buzzed again, a signal flashing across the main console. It was a distress signal, faint and garbled, but it was unmistakable. "We're not the only ones out here," Kara muttered, looking up. "It's a Federation distress beacon." "Patch it through," Grace ordered. The crackling static filled the bridge, and the voice that came through was weak, shaky. This is the Sphinx, Federation-class scout ship. We are under attack. Requesting immediate assistance. The message cut off abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Grace's eyes locked onto the screen. The crew of the Ad Astra had already proven they could outgun a Federation ship, but this was different. A distress signal meant something serious was happening, something the Federation didn't want them to know about. "Rewind the message," Grace said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. Kara worked quickly, her fingers dancing over the console as she pulled the message back up. The voice on the other end of the line had been desperate, its tone heavy with fear. "The Sphinx was ambushed," Grace said after a moment of consideration, her voice calm but full of intent. "The Federation has something they're not telling us about." Her gaze shifted to Jaina. "We can't just ignore it," Kara replied, her voice tense. "That ship's in trouble." Grace took a long, deliberate breath. She knew the risks. The Ad Astra was far from ready to engage in combat with another Federation ship, let alone whatever else might be out there. But the distress signal had planted a seed in her mind, and she knew that they couldn't afford to turn their backs on it. Not now. "We're going in," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "Prepare the weapons. We might have to make a choice soon. Help them, or take the shot." Kara hesitated. "Grace, we don't know what we're walking into. If this is a trap—" "Sadly, we both know it is," Kara said. Grace glanced at her sister. "It's a trap," Grace interrupted. "But we don't have the luxury of waiting around. The Federation knows we're out here. They're watching. And if they think we'll just roll over, they'll send more ships. So we make a choice. We play their game, or we change the rules." Kara felt her pulse quicken, the weight of Grace's words sinking in. The Ad Astra wasn't just a ship anymore. It was their declaration of independence, their statement to the galaxy that humanity would no longer be content to be a second-rate power. It was their weapon, their symbol, and they had to use it, not just to survive, but to take control. The navigation console blinked, indicating they were nearing the Sphinx's last known coordinates. Kara quickly adjusted the ship's trajectory, weaving through debris fields and asteroid belts as they got closer. The Ad Astra was beginning to hum again, her systems firing on all cylinders as the crew moved into position. The ship had come a long way from being a barely functional hulk. Every modification they made, every part they scavenged, had turned the ship into something far more dangerous, and now, with the pulse cannon firing on all cylinders, they had a weapon that could make even the mightiest fleet think twice. "We're almost there," Kara said, eyes glued to the readouts. "Targeting systems are coming online. Should be able to get a lock in a few minutes." Grace nodded from the bridge. "Good. Keep your focus, Kara." The tension was thick in the air as they approached the coordinates. There was no turning back now. As the Ad Astra closed in on the last known location of the Sphinx, the crew braced themselves for whatever awaited them. Suddenly, a sharp warning blared through the comm system. "Multiple contacts, Captain. It's the Federation." Before Grace could respond, the Ad Astra was rocked by a sudden blast, sending a shudder through the ship. A Federation cruiser, massive and imposing, appeared on the scanners. It was already in position, weapons charged and ready. The distress signal had been a trap, a lure to get them into the open. "Damn it," Grace muttered, slamming a fist against the console. "They've been waiting for us." "Push shields up," Kara shouted, hands moving frantically over the controls. "We've got incoming." The Ad Astra's shields flared to life just in time to absorb the first volley of energy blasts. The ship shook violently under the impact, but the shields held. For now. Grace's voice cut through the chaos. "We fight. We take them down before they can do any more damage." Kara didn't hesitate. She rerouted power to the weapons array and fired the pulse cannon. The ship jolted again as the cannon discharged, a massive beam of energy rocketing toward the Federation cruiser. The cannon's output was unstable, and the ship groaned under the strain. But the pulse hit its target, tearing into the cruiser's hull. The ship's shields flared and buckled under the force. "We've got a breach," Kara said, her voice tight. "They're not going down without a fight." Grace's expression was hard as steel. "We're not going down either." The Ad Astra wasn't just a junk starship anymore. It was their weapon, and it was time to make the galaxy realize it. The Ad Astra was a rusted wreck, an ancient hulk drifting in the vast emptiness of space, her once glorious lines now scarred and misshapen, her hull battered by decades of neglect. She was barely more than a derelict, a forgotten vessel handed over to humanity with little more than a cold warning from the United Federation. "Prove your worth. If you can handle this scrap, then maybe, just maybe, you'll be worthy of the stars." To the Federation it was a test, a joke, a way to throw humanity into the deep end, forcing them to scramble for survival in the vast unknown. But what the Federation hadn't accounted for was the human will to survive and to innovate. Inside the Ad Astra, things weren't much better. The walls creaked and groaned under the strain of space travel, and the low hum of dying machinery could be heard in every corner of the ship. The overhead lights flickered, sometimes going out for days at a time, and the air filtration system was a gamble on whether or not it would hold up. But it wasn't the ship that made this mission possible. It was the crew, broken, stubborn, and determined to prove the Federation wrong. Kara Hawkins, the chief engineer, had seen a lot of junk in her day, but this one took the cake. The first time she'd laid eyes on it, she'd wanted to laugh or cry. There were holes in the outer plating. The engine's power core was so outdated it barely functioned, and the communications system had a tendency to pick up static on every frequency. Yet as she stood in front of the massive engine room, surrounded by half-busted consoles and blinking warning lights, she couldn't help but smile. "Looks like a work of art, doesn't it?" she muttered to herself, her hands resting on the cold metal of the engine's main housing. "Well, it's a work of something, all right," came the voice of Ensign Torrin Kay, the youngest member of the crew. He was still too green to understand the depth of what they were doing, but he had an uncanny knack for programming. "If by art you mean a disaster waiting to happen." Kara rolled her eyes but didn't respond. She knew the kid was right. The ship had been on its last legs before they'd even taken control of it, and every day they spent aboard it felt like a race against time. Still, the ship was theirs now, and in a strange, twisted way, they were starting to make it something more. "Anything new with the weapon systems?" Captain Grace Redford asked over the comms, her voice crisp and authoritative. Kara sighed. "I'm making progress, but it's hard to know what'll work and what won't. The Federation didn't exactly leave us with a manual." "We're not here for a manual," Grace responded. "We're here to make our own rules. Just don't blow the ship up before we can prove them wrong." Kara chuckled dryly. No promises. The ship had been assigned to explore the outer reaches of a sector that was largely unexplored, an area where the Federation had little interest. Their orders were clear: go out, gather data, and stay out of trouble. But trouble was the one thing that seemed to follow the crew of the Ad Astra wherever they went. They'd found old debris fields, abandoned space stations, and signs of long-lost civilizations. But all of that was secondary to their real mission, proving they could do more than just survive. They could thrive. And if they could make this junk starship work, they'd prove to the Federation that humanity wasn't just a colony waiting to be guided. It was a force to be reckoned with. It had started innocuously enough. Kara had managed to fix the reactor core, barely. Torin had hacked into the ship's ancient AI system, which was barely functional, but just enough to give them some semblance of control over the ship. They'd patched together a rudimentary weapons system from the ship's cargo holds, scavenged parts, and a series of improvised modifications. Then, just a week ago, it had all changed. Kara had discovered something in the old Federation databanks, a scrap of code buried deep in the system. Something that shouldn't have been there. A blueprint for a weapons array. Not just any weapons array, but a pulse cannon, capable of outputting far more energy than the ship's original design could handle. The question was, could they build it? Could they get it to work? Captain Redford had put the question to the crew, and they'd agreed without hesitation. The answer didn't matter. What mattered was that they had a chance to make something more of this ship, to prove to the Federation that they could and would become the masters of their own fate. In the past few days, the crew had worked tirelessly, stripping out outdated systems, rewiring the entire weapons grid, and repurposing the reactor's power output to fuel the new weapon. It was dangerous, it was reckless, but it was the only way forward. Now, as they neared the edge of Federation-controlled space, the ship was ready. Almost. Grace stood on the bridge, arms crossed, eyes scanning the endless black beyond the windows. There was a sense of tension in the air, a feeling that something was coming. They were approaching the unknown. It was no longer just about survival. It was about asserting their presence in a galaxy that had ignored them for too long. "Captain," Kara's voice came over the comms, breaking her reverie. "We're ready for the test." Grace nodded, even though Kara couldn't see it. "Take the shot." There was a pause before Kara's voice crackled back to life, tinged with nervous excitement. "You're sure about this?" Grace's lips twitched into a smile. "There's no turning back now, Kara. We either succeed or we don't, but we're doing this." The hum of the ship's reactor filled the silence, a low, steady thrum as power surged through the newly constructed systems. Grace could feel it in her bones. The power of the ship, the power of their defiance. The Federation had underestimated them. They hadn't even bothered to believe in their potential. "Charging the weapon now," Kara said, her voice almost a whisper as she worked the controls. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, as the weapon's systems powered up. "We're at full charge. Fire when ready." Grace took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was about to happen. Fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a massive shockwave of energy burst from the weapon array, sending a pulse of bright, crackling energy through the ship's entire frame. The Ad Astra lurched as the beam shot out into the blackness of space, a streak of pure power that lit up the dark like a star being born. The target was a Federation scout ship that had strayed too close to their path. They'd been tracking it for days, watching it, waiting for the right moment. It was a small ship, nothing more than a speck in the grand scheme of the galaxy. But it was the perfect test. When the pulse hit, the scout ship disappeared. It didn't explode in the conventional sense. There was no fireball, no debris. The ship just ceased to exist. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. The pulse had vaporized it down to the atomic level, disintegrating every molecule in its hull. A clean kill. Grace stood in stunned silence as the reverberations of their success hit her like a wave. She could feel the gravity of it in her bones. The Federation would know. They would come for them, and they wouldn't be happy. Caption, Torrin's voice came through. That was unbelievable. We can't. I know, Grace interrupted, her voice quiet but intense. We've done something they didn't expect, something they can't ignore. She stared out into the blackness again, but this time the endless void seemed less like an oppressive weight and more like a canvas one could sleep in while the heart stopped beating. One they could paint on however they wanted. They weren't just players in someone else's game anymore. They were making the rules now. The sound of the crew bustling behind her brought her back to the present. The battle was only just beginning, but it had already changed. The Federation had no idea what they were up against. She watched the two ships drop closer, allowing her more time to study Alfric. She smiled to herself, a grim but satisfied smile. They had handed humanity a junk starship, and humanity had turned it into an unstoppable superweapon. The Ad Astra was a relic, a piece of forgotten history handed over to humanity like an afterthought, a way for the Federation to test whether Earth's best could even survive the harsh reality of space exploration. The ship had been cobbled together from outdated designs, with rusted hull plating, a barely functioning reactor core, and a weapons array that wouldn't have been enough to protect the crew from a swarm of space debris. Yet here it was, thrust out into the void, not as a glorified transport, but as humanity's first test case for the stars. And somehow, despite the Federation's apparent disdain for the crew's competence, they were making it work. Kara Hawkins was no stranger to junk. As a kid, she had spent hours tearing apart broken-down machines, scavenging for parts and putting them back together, sometimes creating something functional, sometimes not. It had always been about making things work, no matter the odds. The Ad Astra, a rusted heap of scrap metal, was no different. There was no manual for the ship, no guidebook telling them what systems would fail next or how to keep it together long enough to make it back home. All they had was ingenuity, and that was a force that Kara had learned to trust above all else. She sat hunched over a series of control panels in the engineering bay, her brow furrowed in concentration as she manually adjusted the fusion reactor's output. The machine hummed beneath her fingers, responding to her careful manipulations. The system was temperamental. One moment it would spike in energy, and the next it would sputter and die. But Kara had learned how to read its quirks like a second language. Her fingers danced across the interface, setting the power levels just right, aware that one misstep could send the ship's core into meltdown. There. Is it holding? Captain Grace Redford's voice crackled through the comm system. Kara's eyes flickered to the diagnostic screen. For now. But we've pushed it too far, Grace. This reactor wasn't built for this kind of output. We don't have time for what-ifs, Kara, Grace replied, her tone cold but not unkind. We need this ship functioning at full capacity, or our mission is over before it even starts. I know, Kara muttered. She wiped the sweat from her brow. The atmosphere inside the engine room was thick with tension, the stifling heat from the reactor mixing with the stale air of the ship's underbelly. The Ad Astra wasn't just a test for the Federation, it was a test for them too, a test of their resilience, of their ability to make something out of nothing. Humanity had been handed a broken, obsolete starship, but they had found a way to push its limits. I was handed a bandaged ship. They had found a way to make it something more. The ship's reactor hummed again, louder this time, and Kara glanced at the screen. The power surge indicator was flashing red. We've got a spike. Reactor pressure's climbing. Jested now, Grace snapped, her voice sharp with urgency. Kara's fingers flew over the panel, overriding safety protocols and forcing the system to bleed off some of the excess pressure. The humming quieted, the alarm lights dimming as the power levels stabilized. It was only a temporary fix. Kara could feel it, deep in her gut. But it was enough for now. They had bigger problems to worry about. They had come far too close to failure already. Status report, Grace ordered, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. The reactor's holding for now, but we're still not out of the woods, Kara replied. I'm rerouting power to the weapons array. If this ship's going to be anything more than a glorified transport, we need a superweapon. Understood, Grace said. Keep me posted. With a sigh, Kara set to work, her mind running through the ship's systems as she calibrated the various subroutines. The Ad Astra had never been intended for combat. It wasn't even supposed to be a frontline ship. But when they'd first started making modifications to the vessel, Kara had discovered something buried deep in the ship's ancient Federation files. A weapons system blueprint, coded into the ship's core software. It had been hidden, locked away, and at first, Kara had assumed it was a mistake. After all, what good was a weapons system in a ship like this? But then, a spark of curiosity had taken over. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if it was intentional? What if the Federation had known something they didn't? The answer, it turned out, was buried in the schematics. The Ad Astra wasn't just an old cargo freighter. It had once been intended as a prototype for a new class of warship. The blueprint revealed a pulse cannon capable of generating incredible energy bursts, far more powerful than anything the ship's old power core had ever been designed to handle. But with some careful modifications and a bit of daring engineering, they might just be able to make it work. And that was exactly what they'd done. Kara didn't fully understand how they'd gotten this far, but she knew one thing: if they could fire that pulse cannon, if they could harness the ship's power, then the Ad Astra would become something far more than a rusty relic. It would become a weapon. Something the Federation hadn't prepared them for. Something they could use to carve their own path. To show the galaxy that humanity was more than just an experiment. The mission had started innocuously enough. Scouting new star systems, collecting data, discovering old relics of long-dead civilizations. But the crew had grown tired of being pawns, of playing by the Federation's rules. They had taken matters into their own hands, and now they had something that could change everything. They prepared to transfer potential information issues to places outside the Federation's rules. They had taken matters into their own hands, and now they had something that could change everything. "Torin," Kara called out to the communications console. "How are we looking on that weapons grid?"